All right, welcome everyone to the inaugural Dianoia Annual Seminar in Social and Political Philosophy, featuring Dr. Jeff McMahan. My name is Nevin Klimenhage. I'm a senior research fellow here at Dianoia and the organizer of our seminar series. Australian Catholic University established the Dianoia Institute in April 2019 to build a world-leading research center in analytic philosophy. Our name comes from the Greek word dianoia, which means thought, and is used by Plato in the Republic to denote the reflective and discursive reasoning that leads from mere opinion, doxa, to knowledge or understanding, nous. This year, we launched our online seminar series in philosophy, showcasing research by leading philosophers around the world. I also wanted to mention that Dianoia is currently accepting applications for our master's and PhD programs with a deadline of October 17. If you know of anyone who might be interested in those, please direct them to our website, and I'll drop a link into the chat in a moment here for that. A couple of other notes before we begin our seminar. This event is being recorded, and after the seminar, it will be put on our website. Dr. McMahon's talk will go for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we will have an hour for Q&A. If you have a question that you would like to ask during the Q&A, please message me and I will add you to the queue. Finally, it is our custom at Australian Catholic University to give an acknowledgement of country. We commence our meeting by acknowledging the First Peoples and the traditional custodians of the country where Dianoia is located, the Wurundjeri peoples from the Kulin Nation. We respectfully acknowledge their elders past and present, and remember that they have passed on their wisdom to us in various ways. Let us hold this in trust as we work together and serve our communities. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Jeff McMahan is the White's Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Oxford. He has published 3 books and over 100 articles with a focus on moral and political issues surrounding life and death. His talk for us today is entitled, "It Might Have Been: What Matters in Alternative Possible Lives." All right, over to you, Jeff.
Thank you. I'm really honored to have been selected to give the inaugural lecture in social and political philosophy, and hope that there'll be enough social and political philosophy in the talk to justify your having invited me to do it. Let me begin by noting that there are 2 problems of personal identity. There's personal identity over time and personal identity across possible worlds. Now, the first of these problems is highly familiar. The second has, at least to my knowledge, been less extensively discussed. It's the problem of determining once an individual exists, what, if anything, would have been necessary and sufficient for that same person to have come into existence in different conditions, for example, at a different time. Now, I actually don't have any developed views about this second problem of personal identity across possible worlds or across possible lives. But what I'm going to argue is that for many moral issues, this problem is actually less important than we might have supposed. Parfit, as is well known, argued that identity is not what matters over time, and that this has important implications for various prudential and moral issues. So what I'm going to argue is that identity is also not what matters across possible lives of the same person, and that this too has important implications for certain prudential and moral issues. I'm going to begin by briefly rehearsing some arguments I developed in earlier work about the misfortune of death, abortion, and prenatal injury. These arguments appeal to the view that I've defended about what matters over time. That is, what is the basis of rational, egoistic concern about the future. Now, most of us believe that, in general, an earlier death is a greater misfortune than a later death if the life of which one would be deprived would be well worth living. And this belief is well captured by what I've called the life comparative account of interests. According to this view, the strength of one's interest in avoiding some misfortune is determined by a comparison between the value of the future life one would have with the misfortune with the value of the future life one would have without the misfortune. And this is the natural way of understanding the orthodox deprivation account of the misfortune of death, which holds that the extent to which a particular death would be a misfortune is proportional to the goodness of the life of which one would be deprived by that death. So this deprivation view is naturally interpreted according to the life comparative account of interest. But in fact, this view has really implausible implications when applied to very early deaths. Most of us, for example, don't believe that the death of a fetus or even of a newborn infant is a greater misfortune than the death of a young adult, though the fetus and the newborn infant lose more good life than the young adult would. That is, the effect on their life as a whole is worse. And more generally, and more importantly, we simply don't believe that the worst possible death is to die immediately after one begins to exist. That is, to pop into existence and immediately cease to exist. That is just not the worst death that an individual can suffer. Now, on the view of interests that I have defended, which I call the time relative interest account, the strength of one's interest in avoiding death is actually a function of two factors. First, the degree to which one would be, let me begin with the other one first. First, the amount of good life of which one would be deprived, which is the sole factor acknowledged by this life comparative account. And second, the degree to which one would now be psychologically related to oneself later when the good events of one's future life would occur. And as the label implies, the strength of this interest normally varies over time with variations in both these factors. That is, the amount of good life one would lose and the strength of these relations between oneself now and oneself in the future. Now, this view of what matters over time differs from Parfit's in that it presupposes that the relevant psychological relations, which I call the prudential relations, the prudential unity relations, must be grounded in the physical continuity of the areas of the brain in which mental events are registered. Whereas Parfit believed that a psychological connection is just a relation of qualitative similarity between an earlier mental state and a later mental state, which needn't be causally related in any way. But otherwise, my understanding of what matters over time basically follows Parfit. It's just that I insist on physical continuity, and he thinks that physical continuity and indeed any causal relations are actually irrelevant. Now, the relevance of this is that I'm going to assume that just after someone like you or me begins to exist, that individual is in no way psychologically connected to itself in the future. If, as I believe, we begin to exist with the onset of the capacity for consciousness, we are at that point psychologically related to ourselves in the future only by continuity of consciousness, which in this case, I think, is insufficient to ground any interest in future events in one's own life. Now, I think that there are hypothetical examples in which mere continuity of consciousness seems sufficient for some degree of egoistic concern about the future, but I think the case of a fetus is not among these cases. I can go into that later if you'd like. So for our purposes, we can consider only abortions that occur shortly after one of us has begun to exist. And on the view of when we begin to exist that I just articulated, 99% of all actual abortions occur before one of us begins to exist. So I want to just impose this restriction on my discussion today. And given this restriction, the time relative interest account implies that abortion does not frustrate any interest of the fetus. Now, I concede that a late-term abortion after the fetus has begun to develop psychologically may frustrate the very weak interest that the fetus would have at that point in continuing to live. But late-term abortions constitute only a fraction of 1% of all actual abortions. And for simplicity, I'm just not going to discuss them here. And in fact, I want to use a couple of these terms in a stipulative way for just, again, for convenience. So I'm going to use the term abortion just to refer to abortions that are performed within a few weeks of our having begun to exist. Whenever it is that we begin to exist, you can adjust that for whatever your own view is about when we begin to exist. And I'm similarly going to use the term fetus to refer just to ourselves within the first few weeks after we have begun to exist, whenever that is. Now, again, I've argued in earlier work that these claims about the fetus and its interest in continuing to live support a highly permissive view of abortion. And I trust that that's obvious. And it's because death is not a misfortune for someone who has just begun to exist. And I believe, though I'm not going to argue for it here, that there's no plausible basis for the attribution to the fetus of a moral status that would make killing it seriously objectionable for reasons completely independent of its interests. Indeed, according to the time relative interest account, there's no difference in substance between death immediately after an individual has begun to exist and that individual's never coming into existence at all. And if that's right, I think abortion must be relevantly like preventing a person from existing or coming into existence. There is, moreover, no moral difference between preventing a person from coming into existence and simply not causing a person to exist if other things are equal. But if it's not wrong not to cause a well-off person to exist, it follows on these assumptions that it's also not wrong to have an abortion if other things are equal. And, I was pleased with this result. My intuitions told me that abortion was very unlike the killing of a person. But I came to believe later that these same assumptions also seem to support a conclusion that I find highly unwelcome, namely that the infliction of prenatal injury may also often be permissible, or that there may be no significant objection to the infliction of prenatal injury. And that's because if their lack of psychological connections to their future selves means that fetuses have no interest in continuing to live, making abortion permissible, it also means that they have no interest in avoiding bad effects in the future that might be caused by prenatal injury. Indeed, if painlessly killing a fetus is relevantly like preventing a person from coming into existence, as I suggested a minute ago, then injuring a fetus in a way that will make its subsequent life less good should be relevantly like causing a less well-off person to exist rather than causing a different, better-off person to come into existence. In neither of these cases is there anyone with an interest in having the better life without the injury. So let me give you a very short test for our intuitions about this. In a way, I think the test supports the claims that I have just made. Suppose that for a certain reason, whatever it might be, one person injures an embryo in utero. And suppose that For exactly the same reason, another person chooses to implant an embryo with an injury that is an identical injury to the one that the first person would inflict. So suppose this other person chooses to implant an embryo with an identical injury rather than implant an identical twin embryo that's uninjured. So one injures an embryo, the other person chooses to implant an injured embryo rather than an uninjured embryo. Now, according to the time relative interest account, there's no morally significant difference between the one person's infliction of prenatal injury and the other person's causing a less well-off person to exist rather than a different, better-off person. But in a way, I find this rather worrying, because if an argument for the permissibility of abortion is also an argument for the permissibility of inflicting prenatal injury, or even if it's also an argument for the claim that prenatal injury is substantially less morally objectionable than we have assumed, that seems to be a reason for doubting that the argument can be correct. And that's because the infliction of prenatal injury seems to be very substantially morally objectionable. Now, I mentioned a short while ago what I call the life comparative account of what matters over time. And unlike the time relative interest account, the life comparative account has an obvious explanation of why prenatal injury is wrong. Namely, it causes the victim to have a less good future life as a whole, rather than a better future life. And to have the less good of two possible lives certainly seems to be against the fetus's interests, and thus would be worse for the fetus, both now and in the future. So the life comparative account has what seems to be a good explanation of what's wrong with prenatal injury. But as we've seen, the life comparative account also seems to imply, implausibly in my view, that abortion is far more objectionable than the infliction of prenatal injury. For abortion inflicts the greatest possible loss that an individual can suffer, namely the loss of a whole life that would have been well worth living. So it may seem that neither the time relative interest account nor the life comparative account can explain why abortion is generally permissible, or at least much less objectionable than the infliction of prenatal injury. And that the infliction of prenatal injury is itself seriously morally objectionable. Now, I came to think a while back that there's really a rather obvious response to the charge that the time relative interest account can't explain why prenatal injury is significantly more objectionable than abortion. According to the time relative interest account, abortion frustrates no present interest of the fetus, but it also just prevents the fetus from ever having any other interests. There's thus no one for whom an abortion is bad or worse, except in the life comparative sense. Prenatal injury, by contrast, although it doesn't frustrate any present interest of the fetus, will frustrate many interests that the fetus will later have, independently of whether or not the injury is inflicted. And because of this, prenatal injury is worse for the individual who's now a fetus. It's worse, moreover, not just in the life comparative sense, but because of the effect that it will have on the individual's later interests. So like I said, I used to think that these claims I've just made, were plausible and offered an obvious response to this objection to the time relative interest account. But I now think that they are largely mistaken. While it's true that the infliction of prenatal injury normally frustrates some of the victim's interests, that is, its later interests, Many or most of the interests that will be affected by prenatal injury will normally not be frustrated by the injury, but will in fact be better satisfied than they would have been had the injury not been inflicted. Now, I realize this is paradoxical, but let me explain. It's because if a fetus suffers an injury, its subsequent life is likely to be very different from the way it would have been in the absence of the injury. The extent to which an individual's life is likely to diverge from the life that that individual would have had if the injury had not been inflicted is, of course, a matter of degree. But in many instances, the divergence is very extensive, especially if it begins around the time of birth and steadily increases over time. The injured infant may, for example, require treatments it would not otherwise have needed. And as it becomes older, its activities may be limited in ways they would otherwise not have been limited. And each of these differences, along with many others, will itself produce many more differences. For example, by causing the child to meet and form relationships with different people from those he would otherwise have established relations with. Now, as I hope you can see, this is an extreme instance of a pervasive phenomenon. That is, our actual lives are constantly diverging from alternative possible lives we might have had if we had made different choices, or if certain events had not occurred, or if different events had occurred instead. Here's a mundane example. Suppose that a young philosopher accepts a position in a less good department after having been rejected for a position in a much better department. Her life may then evolve quite differently from the way that it would have if she'd been offered and had accepted the other position. She'll meet and become close to people she wouldn't otherwise have met. And her academic and political concerns and her recreational interests and so on are likely to develop very differently from the way they would otherwise have developed. So that after some years, the interests she'll have formed as a result of her attachments to particular people, because of her commitments to certain projects and so on, will be quite different from the interests she would have developed or formed if she had been offered and had taken the better job. So that's just one example. They're endless. But prenatal injury is likely to make a far more extensive difference to a person's life than a mere difference in employment. This is in part because the divergence between the actual life and the alternative possible life begins much earlier. Not only would virtually all of the details of the person's life have been different in the absence of the injury, but the person herself may become entirely different from the way she would have been had the injury not occurred. And because the particulars in her life and her attachments to those particulars are very different from those she would have had in the alternative life without the injury, many or most of the interests she will have had, she will have in her actual life, will be different from those she might have had without the injury. Of course, some of the interests she has in her actual life with the injury have nothing to do with her attachments to particulars or to her own particular projects or whatever. They're ones that she would have had even in the absence of the injury. Perhaps the most obvious interest of this sort is the interest in avoiding suffering. That's an interest that everyone has, and is thus an interest she would have had in any possible life. We can call interests of this sort generic interests. But I think generic interests actually constitute only a small proportion of an individual's interests. They contrast with what we can call an individual's distinctive interests, which are concerned with particular ways in which that individual's well-being might be enhanced or preserved, for example, through the flourishing of that individual's relations with other people, or the successful pursuit of that individual's particular ambitions, and so on. And it's a person's distinctive interests that are likely to depend on whether or not the person has been injured prenatally. Like generic interests, moreover, a person's distinctive interests can be frustrated by prenatal injury. But it's possible, however, particularly if certain conditions are satisfied, that only a relatively small number of a person's actual interests will be frustrated by her having been injured prenatally. And paradoxically, this may be more likely to be true the more serious and severe the injury is. So let me cite 4 conditions in which this kind of thing is most likely to occur. That is, that a person's distinctive interest will be very different if prenatal injury is inflicted on that individual from what they would be if the individual were not injured. First, prenatal injury causes the injured individual's life to begin right from birth to develop differently from the way it would have developed without the injury, the kind of condition that I noted earlier. Second, the divergence between the actual life and the alternative possible life is extensive, even soon after birth, and increases rapidly over time. Third, the interests that are affected by the prenatal injury are mostly distinctive rather than generic. If that's the case, they're less likely to be frustrated. And finally, even though the divergence between the actual life with the injury and the alternative possible life without the injury begins early, the bad effects of the injury don't begin to occur until later, after the person has developed extensive interests concerned with the particulars in her actual life. In these conditions, that is, when these 4 conditions characterize the life of an individual who's suffered prenatal injury, it's likely that most of the interest that the person will have given the injury will be better satisfied in her actual life than those same interests would have been in the life she would have had without the injury. I mean, I want to acknowledge that she wouldn't actually have had those interests. I mean, what I've been claiming is she wouldn't actually have had those same interests in the alternative life. Nevertheless, those interests could have been satisfied in that alternative life. But the reason that a person's interests in her actual life with a prenatal injury are likely to be better satisfied in that life than they would have been in the alternative life is that the objects of these interests wouldn't have been present at all in the alternative life without the injury. Let me explain why. I mean, in some ways this is obvious. Many of the person's actual interests may be concerned, for example, with her relations with her spouse. But it's highly likely that she would never even have met the person who is her actual spouse in the life that she would have had in the absence of the prenatal injury. And many of her other interests may be concerned with her relations with her child. But it's virtually certain that that child would never have existed if she hadn't been injured prenatally. She may well have had a child in that alternative life without the injury, but it would have been a different child, not a child that she actually cares about. So, and this is the crux. This is the important point. From within her actual life, the person may be able to recognize that the alternative life she could have had would have been impartially considered a better life. but in part because her actual interests will be better satisfied in her actual life than they would have been in the alternative, better life, there may be no time in her actual life at which it would be egoistically rational for her to regret that she didn't have that alternative, better life. In fact, it may be true that at all times in her actual life, it's egoistically rational for her to be glad that she has the less good of the two possible lives. And we can refer to this phenomenon, that it can be egoistically rational for a person not to regret having failed to have a better life, as the divergent lives problem. In fact, I'm probably not going to use that label again in the talk, but that's the label that I've assigned to this problem, though I haven't published anything about it yet. And what the divergent lives problem shows, I think, is, as I said earlier, that identity is not what matters across possible lives. If identity were actually the ground of our rational attitudes to alternative possible lives, it would be rational for any person at any time in her actual life to regret not having had any better alternative life that she might have had if she had chosen differently or if different events had occurred. And we can refer to the view that it is always rational for a person to regret not having the best possible life that she could have had as the life comparative account of what matters across possible lives. It's parallel to the life comparative account of what matters over time. But what I hope this discussion has shown is that this view is mistaken, just as the life comparative account of what matters over time is mistaken. They both presuppose that identity is what matters. But identity is not what matters, either over time or across possible lives. So you must be thinking, well, what does matter then? What are the bases of our rational attitudes to alternative possible lives? And I think that there are two, just as, or at least two, just as there are two factors that matter to the rationality of our egoistic concern over time. The first is the extent to which what one rationally cares about would have been present in an alternative life. For example, one's relations with particular people, one's particular commitments, ambitions, and so on. In short, one's interests. Whatever one's actual interests are in one's life are what matter in assessing an alternative possible life one might have had. If most or all of one's actual interests would have been better satisfied in an alternative life, as is likely to be true for a considerable period after an adult suffers a serious misfortune, then of course it's presumptively rational to regret not having had that life. We all regret not having had lives that we might have had if we hadn't suffered certain recent misfortunes. But as I've tried to suggest, this isn't characteristic of what seem to be misfortunes that occur very early in life. The second factor corresponds to the second factor that matters or matters over time. And this is the extent to which one would have been psychologically similar to oneself as one is. One would have been in the alternative possible life. So the extent to which one would have been different psychologically in an alternative possible life, that is the extent to which one would have had a different character, different beliefs, values, attitudes, memories, and so on. To that extent, what matters across the possible lives is diminished or lacking. Thus, just as psychological discontinuity over time is subversive of what matters over time, So psychological dissimilarity is subversive of what matters across possible lives. I'm going to care less, or my rational attitudes are not going to be highly favorable to an alternative possible life in which I would have been very different from the way that I am now. So in summary, just as our interests in our future are a function both of the magnitudes of potential benefits and harms and of the strength of the prudential unity relations, so the rationality of our egoistic attitudes to alternative possible lives is a function both of how much those lives would have contained of what we actually care about and of the degree to which our psychological nature in those lives would be similar to our actual psychological nature. Now, the egoistic attitudes that it's rational to have towards alternative possible lives typically vary over time. In the case of persons, what matters in a life one might have had is typically preserved, as I said a moment ago, for a considerable period after the point of divergence from the actual life. But when the divergence occurs very early, before an individual becomes a person, in the Lockean sense, there are neither significant interests that might exist in an alternative life, nor a substantial psychological nature that might be preserved or lost in an alternative life. There's therefore little of what matters to begin with, and there's progressively less of what matters as time goes on. Now, so what matters varies with time in this way, and because what matters in our egoistic attitudes to alternative possible lives varies with time, we can refer to the view that identity of interests and psychological similarity are the two main elements of what matters across possible lives as the time relative interest account of what matters across possible lives. Very ugly and clunky label, but I'll use it anyway. Okay, that's the view. And what I want to do now is return to the problem of prenatal injury and explain the application of the view. I noted earlier that just as the time relative account of what matters over time suggests that abortion is morally no different from preventing a person from existing, so both time relative interest accounts suggest that prenatal injury is in fact morally no different from causing a less well-off person to exist rather than causing or allowing a different, better off person to exist. But because most people believe that there is a strong moral reason not to inflict prenatal injury, this implication of the time relative interest accounts, if it's correct, supports the view that there actually is a strong moral reason to cause or allow a better off person to exist rather than to cause or allow a different, less well-off person to exist. And so we can call this view, following Johann Frick, who uses this label, we can refer to this as the non-identity intuition, as it's the common intuitive response to cases involving the non-identity problem. In those cases, we think there really is a reason to cause a better off individual to exist rather than a different, less well-off individual. That's the sort of moral of the non-identity problem. Now, most people accept the non-identity intuition, but we all have trouble understanding exactly how strong this reason is. That is the reason to cause a better off individual to exist. Most of us, I suspect, find it difficult to believe that the reason to cause a better off individual to exist rather than a different, less well off individual is just as strong as the reason we have not to inflict prenatal injury. Now, we might claim that the explanation of why the reason not to inflict prenatal injury is stronger is that the infliction of prenatal injury would be worse for the injured individual, whereas to cause a less well-off individual to exist rather than a better-off individual wouldn't be worse for the less well-off individual and would, if anything, be good for that individual, provided his life would be well worth living. So there is this problem here. How much does it matter that an act or an outcome would be worse for someone? That might explain the difference between the infliction of prenatal injury and causing one person to exist rather than another. Parfit, again, as I trust is fairly well known, denied that it makes any difference morally, whether an act or outcome is actually worse for somebody. And he referred to this view as the no difference view. It makes no difference whether an act or outcome is worse for somebody, provided it involves some bad effect. And interestingly, the main example to which he appealed for support, or for intuitive support for this view, is relevantly just like my comparison between injuring an embryo on the one hand and selecting an injured embryo for implantation rather than selecting an otherwise identical uninjured embryo for implantation. Now, in this case, there's of course a sense in which injuring the one embryo is worse for the later person. And it's true that that person can later truly claim that the injury caused him to have the less good of two possible lives, and for that reason was worse for him. But Parfit believed, and thought others would agree, that there is no significant moral difference between injuring the one embryo on the one hand and selecting the injured embryo on the other. He thought this was intuitive, and I've always intended to agree with him about that, but I've never been able to accept the no difference view for other reasons. And I think I now have a sense of how to reconcile those two claims. And it is as follows. As we've seen, that prenatal injury would cause the individual to have the less good of two possible lives is not what matters from that individual's own point of view at any time in his actual life. At all times, the alternative life is just alien to him. It's relevantly like the life of a different person. I think we might articulate this by saying that although the alternative life without the prenatal injury would have been better in the life comparative sense, it's not better, and indeed it's worse in what we can call the egoistic reason sense, as the person has at all times an egoistic reason to be glad that he did not have the better life. Now, of course, I should concede that all of this would be entirely different if the fetus had a strong present interest in not being injured or in having the better of two future lives. But this is what's ruled out by the time relative interest account of what matters over time. So while the life comparative sense of better or worse for is indeed the relevant sense if identity is what matters across possible lives, I've argued that identity is in fact not what matters. What matters are sameness of interests and what we might call transworld psychological connections. There's psychological connections, forms of psychological similarity between the person in that person's actual life and the person in an alternative life. And between the actual life of a person who's been injured prenatally and the possible life she would have had in the absence of the injury, these relations are at all times either weak or absent. Hence, a person who is injured as a fetus is unlikely to be able to claim that the life she has with the injury is worse for her in the relevant sense, namely in the egoistic reason sense, not the life comparative sense. So what I conclude is that just as abortion is indeed relevantly like preventing a well-off person from existing, so the infliction of prenatal injury is, particularly when the injury is of substantial severity, relevantly like causing a less well-off person to exist rather than causing or allowing a different, better-off person to exist. Now, these two claims, two claims I've just stated about causing people to exist are familiar in the literature on population ethics, and indeed they even have labels in that literature. The claim that there's no reason to cause a well-off person to exist rather than not cause anyone to exist is one half of the claim in population ethics that's often referred to as the asymmetry. I'm going to call it the negative claim of the asymmetry because it says there is no reason. There's no reason to cause a well-off person to exist rather than not to cause anyone to exist. And of course, as we've seen, the claim that there's a strong reason to cause a better off person to exist rather than to cause or allow a less well-off person to exist is sometimes called the non-identity intuition, and it's familiar in the literature on population ethics because it's the standard response to the non-identity problem. Now, both these claims express common sense intuitions. Let's suppose for the moment that they're correct. If I'm right that abortion is relevantly like preventing a well-off person from existing, then the negative claim of the asymmetry implies that there's no significant moral reason, other things being equal, not to have an abortion. And if I'm right that the infliction of prenatal injury is relevantly like causing a less well-off person to exist rather than a different, better-off person, then the non-identity intuition implies that there's a strong reason not to inflict prenatal injury. So, after all, we do have grounds that are compatible with both time relative interest accounts for the claim that whereas abortion is morally unproblematic, prenatal injury is seriously morally objectionable. That's what I was hoping to try to show. And if I'm right in all these parallels between claims about fetuses and claims about causing people to exist in population ethics, then we do actually have a way of distinguishing morally between abortion on the one hand and prenatal injury on the other, and claiming that the infliction of prenatal injury is substantially morally more objectionable than abortion. But I'm going to quickly conclude the talk with a gesture towards a further serious problem that puts pressure on the last claim I've made, and this is that what I call the negative claim of the asymmetry and the non-identity intuition are in serious tension with one another. You know, I've been appealing to these two intuitive claims from population ethics and saying they help resolve this problem. They're both intuitive. This is what people believe. They provide a way of reconciling the claim that prenatal injury is seriously more objectionable than abortion. But the basic problem is this. If there's a strong moral reason to cause a well-off person to exist when the alternative is that a different, less well-off person will exist, that is still a well-off person, but a less well-off person, how can there be no moral reason at all to cause a well-off person, perhaps even the same well-off person, to exist when the alternative is that no person will come into existence? How is it that whether or not there's a reason to cause a well-off person to exist depends on whether the alternative is that a less well-off person will come into existence, or is instead that no person will come into existence? How can whether or not there's a strong reason to cause a well-off person to exist depend on whether one of these alternatives is the actual alternative? For example, it makes no sense to suppose that it's somehow worse to cause a less well-off person to exist than not to cause any person to exist. So how can we reconcile these two claims, the negative claim of the asymmetry and the non-identity intuition? Now, I'll just say what I'm inclined to think. I'm inclined to think that the best response to this challenge is to reject the negative claim and accept that, in fact, there is a moral reason to cause a well-off person to exist, just because that person would have a life that would be well worth living. That's contrary to common sense intuition, but there are a host of problems that have led me to think that it can't be correct. So this means, given what I've said about the parallels between claims about fetuses and claims in population ethics, this means that I also have to accept that there is indeed a moral reason not to have an abortion. Whatever it is, it's the same reason that there is to cause a well-off person to exist rather than not cause any person to exist. So I'm going to leave the discussion of this further problem of trying to resolve the tension between these two claims in population ethics for another occasion. Also leave, if I'm right in thinking that there in fact is a moral reason to cause a well-off person to exist, I'm going to leave the question of what the strength of that reason might be to for another occasion. So let me say one final sentence, and that is you can probably tell all of this is work in progress. It's muddled and confused and so on. So I'll be very grateful for any thoughts that you might have about these arguments. Thank you. I'm hearing the sound of one hand clapping.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. McMahan, for your talk. Let's take a 3-minute break, and then we will return for Q&A. All right, so a reminder that if you have a question that you would like to ask, please send me a direct message and in the chat, and I will add you to the queue. Our first question is from Steve Finley.
Oh, thank you. I feel I'm hearing too much of my own voice here. Okay, so yeah, so I mean, I find your reasoning very hard to disagree with most of the way. I may sort of part company with you right at the end. So I find myself thinking, well, it's not at all wrong to choose, you know, a less healthy embryo over a more healthy embryo. I think, for example, you know, if a mother, you know, suppose a mother is blind and chooses to a blind embryo over a non-blind embryo, I see no moral objection to that whatsoever, assuming that the blind child will grow up to have a perfectly good life. And so I'm inclined then to just reject what I forget what you called it, but the Frick principle. And then this leads me to my main question, which is methodological, which is why, you know, what credibility should we give our knee-jerk intuitions about cases, thinking that, you know, our intuitions are just pre-reflective, instinctual responses to cases. So if sort of long, careful reasoning takes us to a different conclusion, why not just reject the intuition? I guess that's my question.
Good. Let me briefly respond to the second part of your question first about the kind of epistemic authority of intuitions. I think that particularly population ethics has convinced me that our intuitions, that common sense intuitions, are deeply confused and incoherent, and that some of them are just going to have to be given up. That's unavoidable. We're going to have to give up things that we deeply believe in. But we want to make the best decisions we can about which intuitions to retain and which to abandon. And in this area, I still have no clear idea of which ones should go. I do think it's difficult to argue without appealing to these intuitions. They are the way things seem to us, and that's the starting point. Now, you're inclined to reject the non-identity intuition. let me say two things about what you said about the rejection of the non-identity intuition. One, you appealed to the case of the selection of a blind embryo as opposed to an embryo that would be become a sighted person. And I think that choice of example probably derives from the fact that there's been a lot of controversy about selection of deaf embryos, selection of blind embryos, and so on. And is because these are traits that are characteristic of what are now called identity groups, or groups of people who share some kind of what are now called an identity. And that complicates things in ways that I would rather not go into here. So what I'd prefer to do is to take a kind of uncontroversial case of some kind of injury to a fetus that would be highly likely in most cases to mean that the person who would develop from the fetus would have a less good life for whatever reason. And one of the claims that the advocates of the permissibility of selecting deaf embryos make is that actually the life of a deaf person is in no way less good than the life of a person who can hear. So I just would like to put those claims aside and appeal to some sort of generic, non-specific condition that's highly likely to make a person's life less good. And I don't want it necessarily to, in fact, I don't want it to involve more suffering. I didn't say anything about this in the talk, but that's because I've recently come to believe that the interest in avoiding suffering is less sensitive to the strength or the presence or absence of what I call the prudential unity relations than other dimensions of well-being are. But I don't want to go into that either unless somebody wants to press me on it. What reason is there to think that the non-identity intuition is epistemically well-grounded? Well, there's this. I think our reason not to cause climate change and our reason to try to prevent climate change or the worst effects of climate change is reducible to a reason to cause better off people to exist in the further future than to cause less well-off people to exist in the further future. Our reason not to cause climate change or to prevent climate change is not because climate change would be bad for or worse for the people who would experience its effects, and it's not because climate change or our causing climate change will violate those people's rights. Now, I can't give those arguments here. I gave them in a paper in the Journal of Moral Philosophy that was published just this year, though I wrote it quite a while back. But if I'm right about that, then if we give up the non-identity intuition, we're really going to have no grounds at all to object to climate change, to causing climate change. So I think the non-identity intuition just has to be correct. The question is, how strong is that reason?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just for the record, I think my intuitions break in the other direction, but I've had my say.
I just wanted to say, Jeff, I'm happy to send you the video before we post it on the website too, so that you have so that you can see the Q&A for your note purposes. The next question is from Daniel Cohen.
Thanks. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Daniel. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you. So I'm really interested in this question about what would it be egoistically rational for me to prefer or to regret? So suppose I'm someone who's suffered from some early misfortune, maybe a prenatal injury or some early misfortune that shaped my identity in some way. So I think the answer you give is plausible. So the answer you give is that, well, it depends on to what extent would my interests have been satisfied in this alternative possible future. Okay, but then there's an interesting ambiguity in that, which you don't note, but it's you could. I think what you do is you rigidify the interests. You say, when you answer the question, you take my actual interests and you ask, well, to what extent would my actual interests have been satisfied in this alternative possible life? The other way of answering the question is not to rigidify my interests and just to think about it this way: to what extent would my interests, as they would have been, be satisfied in that alternative possible life? So that seems to be an equally plausible way of answering the question, whether that alternative possible life whether it would be egoistically rational for me to prefer that alternative possible life. So I don't think that's involves reverting to some sort of impersonal consideration. I think this is a tension within the personal. From my personal egoistically rational perspective, I feel torn between the rigidifying to my actual interests and also switching over to these alternative interests. So I suppose that I'd be interested to know whether you kind of recognize that ambivalence that I'm feeling. So if I try to put myself in those shoes, on the one hand, I agree with you. I think, yeah, good. All the good things in my life are relative to my just don't make any sense in this alternative possible life. But on the other hand, I would have had other loved ones, and I would have loved them, and I would have had a better life in other respects. So I feel that tension.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I would have had different interests in the alternative possible life, and that those interests would have been, in a way, maybe stronger interests, and they would have been better satisfied in that alternative life than the weaker interests that would be less well satisfied in this life, is precisely what makes the other life a better life, impartially considered. So I was wanting to, I did say that the person can recognize that an alternative possible life would have been a better life. But my point is, it's too much like the life of an entirely different person to be a life that I can now wish that I had, or that I can regret not having. And it's precisely the appeal to my attachments to particular people that I think makes that claim vivid and compelling. So here I am in my actual life, and we can't know these counterfactual claims, but suppose, the local fortune teller, or suppose God, if there were one, were to come to me and say, look, if you had had this alternative life that diverged from your actual life more or less at birth, you would have fallen in love with a different person. You would have had a better life with that person. It would have been a more fulfilling relationship than the life with your actual wife. And you would have had different children, but you would have loved them even more, and they would have been even better children. They would have done a lot better than your lousy children have done in your actual life, and so on. Don't you wish you had married this person and had these children rather than these people you kind of actually care about? And if I think about that, I think, no, that's horrible. My children never existing? No, I want the children I love and the spouse I love. And I want to be a philosopher rather than the great businessman I would have been in that other life, and achieved important things or whatever. I would have been a far more successful scientist or doctor than I have been successful as a philosopher. I don't care. I care about philosophy, not being a scientist or a doctor. So I don't want that life. What's more, I would have been very different. I would have been much nicer and all kinds of things, but that wouldn't be me.
But of course, it would have been you by stipulation. This is an alternative version of your life.
I know, but I mean that in the sense in which we say of somebody, who's changed and so we just say he's just a different person.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. It's literally the same person, but metaphorically, we say we don't recognize the person we used to know. I don't recognize that person I would have been as me.
Thanks. I suppose my point is just that I feel there's a touch of ambivalence. I agree with everything you said, but I also feel like, if I'm fully honest, I can also feel a touch of regret. If I really take seriously this counterfactual, then I feel like there's some sort of tragedy, which you kind of, maybe it's convenient to kind of think, oh yeah. And of course, it's really nice for someone who had a prenatal injury to think, oh, that's irrelevant. But if they're really honest, isn't there something like, well, it's, and it's not just an impersonal imposition of an arbitrary external value. It's like, that would have been me. And I can imagine, well, maybe you may or may not, the extent to which you can imagine it is obviously playing a big role in your argument. But even if I can't fully embody that imaginative possibility, I don't know, I still feel the ambivalence, but no, you don't need to go. I think.
Well, can I say one more thing, Nevin? Is it okay for me to quickly add? I mean,
Yeah.
You could have the same kind of ambivalence about future possibilities. So with respect to what matters over time. So suppose somebody tells me, you can either go on and have the future life you're in fact going to have, which will be, okay, and you'll be closely psychologically connected to yourself at all times in your future and so on. Or we can offer you a vastly better, happier life with lots more pleasure and a lot less suffering and so on. But in order to have that life, we're going to have to manipulate your brain matter so that there's going to be a lot of psychological discontinuity. You're going to be changed into a quite different person. You're not going to be able to remember much of your previous life, and your character is going to be different, and your beliefs and so on. But it will be a better life. It'll have much higher levels of well-being, and it'll be a longer life and so on. Do I want that? Well, you may have the same kind of ambivalence, but I'm still going to settle for the life with what I think is what matters, rather than the better life with less of what matters. So yeah. I think it's helpful to shift, to think by analogy with what matters over time.
Yeah, thanks.
Philip Lee has a follow-up.
Yeah, so thanks very much for the talk. I basically agree with you most of the way, and it was a great talk. And I had a thought that's very similar to Daniel's, but my thought was more specifically that what do you think about interest to have different interests? So I've found myself quite frequently having the thought that had I, being able to choose to have different dispositions, maybe, in high school I wasn't so insecure and I got into philosophy, maybe I would have, being a chef, and I would have loved to be a chef for my life, and I would have loved that life precisely because I have this interest to have different interests. So I mean, this might not be a problem for your account, so you might be able to incorporate it, but I would just like to know what you think about it.
Sorry, I'm just having slight problem fully understanding the idea of having an interest in having different interests. Can you explain it a little bit more? I mean, so, okay, let's take the example of you in high school. So what you're saying, in high school, you were a shy kind of person, a bit timid. So you went off in a corner and read philosophy books with the other shy, timid people, because that didn't require you to be very assertive. But what you really wanted to be was a chef. It seems to me that you really just did have an interest in being a chef that was stronger than your interest in being a philosopher, but you just couldn't satisfy that interest because of your nature.
Well, so that's not exactly what I had in mind. So maybe back then, given my disposition at the time, it seems like I had a stronger interest in being a philosopher, but I also have an interest that, you know, had I had different dispositions or different interests, I would have been a chef and I would have loved that life. So it makes sense for me to, let's say, egoistically also value that life, maybe even more than my philosopher life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It may well make sense. And I'm wondering if the reason why it makes sense is that, as I said before, this is a divergence between your actual life and an alternative possible life that takes place at a time when you're already basically an adult person. And so for a substantial period of time, you can actually rationally regret that you went off into philosophy rather than being a chef. You can still feel the pull of being a chef. You can still look across from your actual life into that possible life as a chef and think, God, how great it would be if I could be in some classy restaurant making all this incredibly good food with, exercising, these incredible culinary skills with great sensitivity and so on. You can feel the pull of that from within your actual life. Now, I'm going to tap you on your shoulder and remind you, yeah, but look, all the people you know and care about and everything, or many or most of the people that you know and care about are people that you met through philosophy and so on. And you would never have met these people. So think about this kind of carefully. That it's both ways. You'd like the pleasures of being a chef, but you'd also like to keep the friends you've got and so on, and not have a life with, staffed with completely different people you don't actually know and so on. So the more time passes, the greater your ambivalence about this should be, because there are many dimensions to this. But it's we can make sense of your wistful yearning for life as a chef precisely because you still care about the things that attracted you to being a chef. They are still part of your, they're still part of your interests now.
Right. So I guess it will be, so it will be irrational for me now to have an interest to basically change all of my interests, I guess, to be a chef, something like that.
Well, here's the problem. I mean, in a way that you're now converting it to a problem of what matters over time. Could you now change your interests? That's a question about time. Could you now alter things in your life in such a way that your interest in becoming a chef would once again become greater than or stronger than your interest in continuing in philosophy? And if you could do that, and that would give you a better life in the future without tremendous psychological discontinuity, then yeah, it could be rational for you it could be in your interest to try to change your interest, yeah. In part because that would not involve, it would involve some psychological discontinuity, but it would be discontinuity over time, and it wouldn't be so, the discontinuity wouldn't be so great as to undermine the rational basis of your egoistic concern about the future. No, thanks, that was really interesting.
Stephanie Collins is next.
Cool, thanks. So this might be clarificatory, but I wanted to ask about the comparative strength of the reasons that we have to harm different people. So you made this distinction between, what was it, distinctive interests and generic interests. So I'm interested in this particular relationship versus my interest in not suffering. And I was thinking about like teenagers, I don't know, it's kind of related to Philip's question, I guess, in that way. So 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, these people they have interests. Take someone who doesn't, they don't really have many close relationships, right? They have interest in having some close relationship and having some career, but not in having any particular close relationships with particular people. And they don't have an interest in having any particular career. And so this is a person where if I harm this person, I'm harming the generic interests, their interests in not suffering or whatever, but their particular interests in they don't have interest in being a chef or in being a philosopher. Their particular interests aren't very well formed yet. And it seems like on your view, it's less wrong to harm this person. I mean, I guess there's a question about what it means to harm this person, so maybe I just want to hear more about that. But it seems like it's less wrong to harm this person than to harm a fully formed adult who has all these attachments and particular things that they're doing. Is that right, that that's the upshot of your view, or B, do I just not really understand what it would mean to harm such a person? Yeah, I'm thinking about the interest in between the particular ones and the generic ones almost. Or how bad is it to harm teenagers? Is another, another way of asking the question.
Well, I think okay. That's very helpful. Thanks very much for posing that problem, because I've been looking at kind of all or nothing cases. The all case being the sort of fully formed adult, the nothing case being the fetus. And you're pressing me to look at the in-between cases and say, you know, in the nothing case, there are no present interests. So what matters over time just isn't an issue. It's all, you know, what matters across possible lives. In the adult case, much more of it is what matters over time. And the divergences across possible lives aren't going to be as great because there's already a fully formed person there. But now you're pressing me on people whose experiences and so on haven't fully shaped them, who don't have highly specific developed interests. And this is sort of, you know, a lot of what matters in this kind of case is what matters over time. These people do have some interests. And these, if you harm them, their present interests are going to be frustrated. But because they've got a lot more time in which to develop and form interests that are adapted to the condition that they'll be in if you harm them, and their lives will change, there's going to be less reason for them later to regret what you've done. So there's this clash. Yeah, that's just, you know, I hadn't fully appreciated that, Stephanie, yet, that I really need to say a lot more about the in-between cases. Gosh, I'm glad, Nevin, that you're recording this, because I'm tempted just to tell everybody, be quiet for 5 minutes while I write some notes about this, but I'll let it go. Yeah, I think it may well be that what you say is an implication of the view that the reason we have not to frustrate their present interests is going to be a strong reason, but it's going to be offset somewhat by the fact that if we do harm them, there's going to be some substantial period of their later lives when it will be true of them that they won't have egoistic reason to regret having been harmed in that way. So that also, that offsets the strength of that earlier, you know, reason grounded in what matters over time. And I guess as I'm guessing you do, I guess I find that slightly disturbing implication.
Yeah, I was thinking about like, is it worse to be in a car accident that leaves you paraplegic as a teenager or as a 40-year-old? Say as a 40-year-old, you like love soccer. As a teenager, it's a bit unclear what sport you're going to go into. You could go into chess, whatever. So yeah, so then I was thinking, yeah, maybe it is less bad to harm a teenager. But then I also thought there's something, I was thinking about like, you know, the stuff about the child's interest in an open future or whatever, like the Joel Feinberg claim that their child has an interest in an open future. It seems like the teenager loses the ability to develop these particular interests. And so that seemed to press in favor of it being worse for the teenager, or maybe equally bad. I mean, my intuition is it's equally bad for whoever old you are. I mean, you know, those kind of identity things that you pointed to with deaf people to one side for a moment. Yeah, so maybe there's something about having the capacity to develop our particular interests, and that's an interest that people who are not yet fully formed have, and if we harm them, we harm those. But I wasn't sure how those sorts of interests figured into your account.
Yeah, let me just mention this, that as I mentioned earlier to Nevin, there's a very rough but long draft of material on which my talk is based. And I gave that to people at NYU a few weeks ago in preparation for this colloquium that they do at NYU. It used to be the Nagel-Dworkin colloquium. It's now the Scheffler-Murphy. It used to be the Scheffler-Murphy-Waldron colloquium. I think it's now just the Scheffler-Murphy colloquium, and they read it in advance and give comments on it anyway. Jeremy Waldron was there, and his comment on this material is related to what you were saying about it being desirable for individuals to have open futures and to be able to develop their own interest in some sort of autonomous way or whatever. And what Jeremy claimed was that I should be thinking about the fact that if prenatal injury closes off certain possible futures for an individual, and you know, so I do that to someone, that can be an offense against the sort of respect that's due to that person who develops. And that person can say, you closed off these different possible, these possible futures I might have had. What right did you have to intervene in my life to limit my possibilities? So I'm not sure how important a consideration that is, but I wanted to mention that that's a point of intersection between your comment and Jeremy's, both of which are exceedingly interesting. But I think your point was even better. It's really good, and I've got to think about this a lot. So thanks very much for that.
Stephen Winter is next.
Hi, thanks very much for an interesting talk. Just a brief comment on Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie, by the way. Good to see you again. Comment before I think I can make a point that's connected. So first off is I actually happen to have teenagers in the house here, and I can tell you that their interests are strongly defined and very highly articulated on a regular basis. The value I might give those interests might differ from the value that they give those interests, but those interests clearly exist nonetheless. And anyways, so that was a bit of a funny way to go forward.
Well,
can
I intervene at this point?
Yeah, that's right. Sure.
The next point. I mean, what you need to tell these underdeveloped people is that what they think are their interests are not in fact their interests at all. Their interests are objective. These are just their desires, and their desires are not consistent with their actual interests. And that's why you can coerce them and force them to do what you want them to do rather than what they want to do.
There's one walking right behind me right now. So tell you what, I'll take the mic, take the headphones out, and you can just tell them. We'll see how it goes. Okay.
I'm at a very safe distance. That's okay.
What's so funny?
All right. So it's the one I actually intended to ask. I'm thinking about my daughter who's a bit older right now. Good luck with that one. Okay. Much of the talk ran the argument in the counter about harm and injury in counterfactual terms. But if I think back on people like Joel Feinberg, they identify non-counterfactual understandings of harm with respect to threshold failures. Right? And let's put the focus point on the distinction between what you called the sort of distinct interest and generic interest. And that phase of the conversation, you talk about how there's a lot more distinctive interests as somebody develops. I think that's certainly true. I 100% agree with you that living the lives that we actually live give rise to our interests that distinguish them from your interest or my interest and so on. And that can be really important to defining who I am as a person. But there is a range of I think, sort of humanly generic interests, which can be frustrated by prenatal acts, right? And I think we're quite different between somebody, and this maybe is channeling a bit of Jeremy Waldron, when somebody comes along and does something to somebody in a way that frustrates the development of those interests. Now, I recognize the problem of certain kinds of identity, as you describe them, identity groups. We can have examples of blindness or deafness or mobility, which becomes sort of challenging because there's these countervailing issues that come in with the politics of that space. But let's get a case of an injury that occurs that causes someone so that they can no longer digest food. As far as I know, there's no identity group out there of people who cannot digest food and think of that as a valuable way of living in this world. Now, this is something that is like a normal capacity that humans have that help them live a normal life, the capacity to digest food. And if somebody can't digest food, we would think that medical treatment would be appropriate. And so I got a case here where they've got a threshold case where I don't have to look to a counterfactual world where I live another life in which I digest food. I could simply say the capacity that I have to digest food is such that it's not meeting the sort of normal nutritive, I'm able to get the nutrition I need to survive, right? I don't need a counterfactual comparison. That's where guys like Joel Feinberg talk. And so I'm wondering, is there a space there to carve out a distinctive concern for prenatal injuries, which is quite, different, I think, in a way that maybe allows us to distinguish between abortion and prenatal injuries when it concerns generic interests that are threshold failures, like an example of being unable to digest food.
Again, I'm sorry. I'm trying to, I don't recall Joel Feinberg's concept of a threshold injury.
Okay.
Suppose,
well, the example I give is illustrative of it, right? So this is something that, you might hope that a healthy person, when they take in food, they digest it and they get nutrients out of it, right? But suppose there's a group of people out there, when they digest the food, it just doesn't, their internal system just doesn't function so that they get the nutrients out of it, right? They can just eat as much as they want and they just don't get the food. And that would be a medical kind of thing. I say no identity groups that I'm familiar with are built around that particular thing. So we don't have to worry about the politics. And I'm just thinking, like, this is a case of threshold failure, right? The human beings are unhealthy if they cannot digest their food.
Well, not necessarily. I'm what I want to know is what happens to these people and what, in relation to what would have happened if they had the normal capacity for digesting food. So suppose it's the case that these people, because they can't digest food just goes right through them. So they don't gain weight or anything like that. So they can just eat gluttonously all that they want, and they get their nutrients through an intravenous injection every morning. So they live perfectly healthy lives because they get all the nutrients and calories directly into the bloodstream. And they also get the pleasure of eating all the time, as much as they want, and anything they want, no matter how bad it is for them, it just goes right through them.
Would we compensate them for the machine that they have a claim in justice for the, for the machine? If I was the one who'd done this to you, would you come to me and say, hey, you got to pay for the machine that allows me to inject the, so it works still, I think.
Well, I don't know, because I mean, suppose that, I've made this person far better off than the person would have been. And the person gets the machine at a fee that's much, much less than this person would have paid to be able to eat all he wants without becoming overweight. I don't know. Again, it seems to me what the alternative is just really does matter. And I don't want to say, I've harmed that person, I owe that person compensation, when what I've done is actually better for that person. I do remember Joel had a case of the taxi driver who is taking somebody to the airport and drives recklessly and gets in an accident that injures the passenger, who then would have got on the plane that crashed. So
Yep.
all things considered, what the taxi driver did was better for that person. Does the taxi driver still owe some compensation, pay for the treatment? In that case, I think yes. So a lot of it depends on whether there's culpability involved, and so on.
Let's leave it there. I can send you a couple of emails on the threshold conceptions of injury, if that helps.
Okay, yeah, it would. I mean, there's something very interesting lurking here. And in fact, I should mention that after I wrote all this stuff, I took a look, because a student of mine, after I mentioned some of this in a seminar last spring, said, you really got to take a look at David Velleman's paper, Persons in Prospect, in Philosophy and Public Affairs, I think in 2008. And so after I'd written all this, I took a look at what I thought was a relevant few pages of David's article, in which he does sort of anticipate some of this, though his view is very extreme. That is, he anticipates the view that identity is not what matters across possible worlds. He makes some extreme claims, and one of them is that his view of this matter shows that a counterfactual conception of harm is unsustainable, and that we have to have a counterfactual comparative conception of harm is untenable, and what we have to have is a temporal comparative conception of harm instead. Namely, I'm worse off or better off, not in comparison with what would have happened otherwise, but rather I'm only better or worse off in relation to the way I was previously. Now, I think that's a very unwelcome implication of his view, but he embraces it. And what you're suggesting in saying that we don't actually need or shouldn't think of effects on people in counterfactual terms, but can think of some of them in threshold terms, seem similar.
Some of them, I actually just think we have there's different ways in which we can determine harm. And I think we use different techniques at different times. I think I'm a pluralist in this space.
Yeah, I think I agree with you about that. I haven't thought about it really carefully, but in thinking about stuff that Judy Thompson and Matt Hanser have written and so on, I've thought, yeah, we need to be pluralists, particularly if we're thinking about death as a harm and coming into existence as a harm or benefit or whatever. We have to have different comparative and non-comparative concepts of harm and benefit and so on. So I am in agreement with you there.
Dimitri,
yeah, if you do have anything you can send an email, I'd be grateful. Thanks.
Dimitri Gallo has the next question.
Thank you so much for the talk. So I had Daniel and Philip's question, and I kind of wanted to ask it again, in part because I think that in the response, there was a lot of focus on, what your interests are, or whether you would regret the harm being undone. And I just sort of wanted to focus on the question of what the rigidified, sort of the rigidified version of the theory and the unrigidified version have to say about like what harms have actually been done. And I was thinking about a case where, you know, I can either go down the left path or the right path, and I'm the kind of person who's just always going to regret whatever choice I make. So if I go down the left path, I'm going to have, you know, an interest in having gone down the right path. And if I go down the right path, I'm going to have an interest in having gone down the left path. And I was thinking that was a case where the rigidified version is going to say, if you know, I'm sitting there deliberating about whether to go left or right, and you come up and say, just go down the left, and I go down the left, that the rigidified version will say, you've harmed me, because it'll look at the interests that I actually have when I go down the left, which, you know, I have an interest in being on the right, and if you hadn't told me to go down the left, I would have had my actual interests satisfied. But the non-rigidified version is going to say, you haven't harmed me, because the interests that I, you know, will end up with are going to be equally well satisfied whether I go down the left or the right. And I was thinking, you know, not with respect to like what I would prefer to be done, but just in terms of what harm has been done. I guess it feels to me like you haven't harmed me by telling me to just go down the left path. And so I was thinking that was some reason to sort of favor the non-rigidified version of the theory. Is that clear?
No, but only because I'm just being a bit dense, I'm sure. I'm trying to understand the details of the kind of type of person you're describing. If you're the kind of person who always regrets what you've done, this is just this person that whichever path he goes down, he's going to wish he'd taken the other.
Or, I mean, suppose that there's two cults that I could join, and I'm deciding which cult to join, and I have to join one of them. And both of the cults teach their members that it's a grave sin to belong to that cult, and you really have to belong to the other one. So both of the members of these cults have an interest in belonging to the other one, but membership is closed after you join, something like that.
Okay, I think that helps me to. I think that confirms what I was going to say. Or confirms my suspicion that what I wanted to say is right, and that is that this is a person who doesn't understand her own interests. That is, it's just not the case that if the person chooses to join the one cult, when both of the cults say to cult members, you've done the wrong thing, you should have joined the other cult. From the fact that the cult that this person has joined convinces this person that she's made the wrong decision, it doesn't follow. Nothing follows about what her actual interests are. I mean, what her actual interests are in this situation seems to me clear, that she shouldn't join either of these cults. They both give her a totally distorted and false understanding of what her interests are. So she should do something else that would be in conformity with whatever her actual interests are. It seems to me clear she can't possibly have an interest in joining either of these cults. And similarly, a person who always regrets what he's done just doesn't have any sense of what his own interests are. So maybe I'm completely misunderstanding what you're trying to say, but my presentation is based on my assumption that a person's interests are, at least to a very considerable extent, objective. They are not determined entirely by what that person believes, and in particular what that person believes his or her interests actually are. And if that's right, then what we need to consider is what a person's actual interests are, and not just what a person believes about what his or her interests are, and whether a person actually does regret having done what she's done. I mean, my view in the paper has been based on the assumption that regret or absence of regret or gladness or whatever can be egoistically rational. And that's because, you know, meeting some standard of what a person's interests actually are in the person's life as it is.
I want to get
So
to
it's not,
one
so
more question, so I'm going to cut off the conversation there. Sorry, Dimitri. Christian Berry has the last question.
Yes, really fascinating, Jeff. I just wanted to, you focused a lot on this contrast between abortion and prenatal injury, but it struck me that there's nothing really special about prenatal injury as opposed to just injury on your view, right? So, and presumably if I injure somebody at a certain point in their life, depending on the severity of the injury, it won't take too long for it to be the case that their actual interests may be better served either in their actual life than they would have been in the other life, right? So yeah, so I was just sort of in general, and the worry that I guess I have about this account is that it seems not unlikely that that one's interests will diverge much more from what they would have been absent an injury, the more severe the injury is. Mm-hmm. And that's also going to make it probably more likely that there's going to be less rather than more psychological continuity. Yeah. And so then if that's true, then it seems to perhaps have the paradoxical idea that I'm actually harming someone less, the more severe the injury I cause them. Yeah, well, anyway,
if the notion of harm is fully applicable to this kind of case, if Nevin will permit, let me say just a little bit and ask you if I'm getting what you're saying right. Again, you're forcing me to think about something like, as Stephanie did, that I haven't really thought about well enough yet. And that's this. The difference between prenatal injury and ordinary injury of a person is, I think, brought out by what I was saying about the temporal relativity of these assessments or evaluations. So what's particular or peculiar to prenatal injury is that there may never be any time in the life of the actual life of the person who's suffered the prenatal injury at which it would be egoistically rational for the person to wish to have had the other life. But that's not, that's not true ordinarily when one injures an adult. There will be a substantial period after the injury during which it will be rational for the adult to regret that the injury has been inflicted. Now, it may well be that after enough time, the person's life will be sufficiently different from what it would have been that it will cease to be rational for that person to regret that the injury was caused. But then what I think, and I hadn't thought about this, but then what we might have to do is kind of consider, well, what's the overall judgment here? And that may depend on how much of the person's life subsequent to the injury there was in which it was not rational for the person to regret the injury, and how much time there was when it was rational, and to what extent it was rational for the individual to regret it or not regret it or whatever. So again, this isn't, it's not only temporally relative, but it's a matter of degree also at different times. And the question is, how does one somehow aggregate these different temporally indexed judgments? And I haven't got a clue.
I don't either.
But I'm gonna think about all of this. As I say, this is all early days in my thinking about these issues, and what all of you who've spoken have helped me realize is how much more there is to investigate here. I'm just scratching the surface. You're making me realize, and I wish I had more to say, but I don't.
All right, well, that's our time. So let's thank our speaker again.
Thanks, Jeff.